To hand over the webcast over to Ismael.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm really happy to be here today with my friend Rob. And you know that this is a series of webinars we do regularly on this topic, right? Architecting for security operations and security architectures and engineering. But today we want to give you like a different angle. Today we want to talk about the angle of security operations. Now, this is something that we repeatedly talk in class, right? Chances are that most of you work either out of a SOC or some of the work that you do is related to a SOC. Maybe you have to deliver architectures or you have to engineer solutions for a SOC. And that contains a mix of things of endpoint, network, cloud security solutions. This is what we call an all-around defender, right? Which is one of the other topics that we mention a lot in class. And chances are that most of these solutions, they're focused on things like protection, but not necessarily detection, hunting, response, or as we're going to consider today, visibility. That's why it's important that we understand how to architect for security operations. And as we're going to see, sometimes we end up with a lot of things, too many things to do. And the problem is not necessarily the technology, but most of the times is how do I prioritize, right? Based on business context, based on what are the most important use cases I need to work with. So hopefully we're going to cover all of these things, and hopefully you will get away, you will leave this webinar with some practical ideas that you can put into in place right away. So my name is Ismael Valenzuela. I'm, as Jessica mentioned, co-author with Justin Henderson and Eric Conrad of Security 530. And I also teach other classes for SANS, been teaching for SANS for about 10 years now. And I'm also a senior principal engineer at McAfee, where I spend a lot of time doing research and working on enterprise products. You can follow me on about security, right? Hopefully, we're going to share some information that you can find useful, and feel free to tweet any of this stuff as we go along. Rob, how about you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ismael, and thanks, Jessica, for hosting us here. I'm a Sec 530 instructor. I've been working with Ismael for a couple of years now, almost going on almost 10. Geez, it's been a while
I'm
now.
Sorry.
But
sorry about that.
Him and I have been working together in different. We started out working in the same organization. He pulled me into his, and then we moved around and we've changed places, but we've always stayed in contact throughout this time. And one common thread between the two of us has always been our SANS connection. I'm at Psychologize, and what I do for Splunk is I am primarily a SOAR or security operations orchestration and response lead. And what I do is security architecture and trying to tie in their security equipment into a common model of being able to automate and orchestrate those processes through. So I basically take your tools and capabilities, integrate them with our tool set called Phantom, and then with that, I try to provide you some automation and orchestration that gives you flexibility in those capabilities. What we've found, and where I transitioned from McAfee and went to work at Phantom, was one of the things was how do you SOC and how do you get there, right? And one of the things that we found a lot of the times was having an issue of what did you build and how did you architect what you're building? And it really, the class talks about stepping you through your assessment. How did your house get built? What are the structural capabilities? And how does that play into how do you build your dream SOC? What's the goal? What's the end in mind? And a lot of people, some people start with a house that they build. Some people start with an end vision. They look at this beautiful house and that's what they want. Or they come up with a concept of they want certain capabilities, and now it's the puzzle pieces of making them get together. SOCs are the same problem. You get different pieces, right, Ismael, and different things to put together.
Well, it's like, you start with a house and the first thing you want to have is what? It's the heated pool, right? It's the huge playroom, the home theater, right? And the latest and the greatest automation system. So it seems similar to when you're envisioning what your SOC will look like, right? With all these big screens and monitors and pew maps. Of course, lots of monitors because there's never enough monitors. The dashboards, right? You can see absolutely everything. But that's the key thing, right? Are you going to be able to see absolutely everything? Is that the reality?
Yeah. Maybe it isn't, but I think you're going to show us something that is going to be a little bit different, right?
Well, this is typically based on our experience, what you end up with, right? What most of us will get is something more like this. Either you have inherited something that's called a SOC, and maybe it's just a one-man shop that maybe just a guy looking at a SIM, right? And a SIM is not a SOC either, right, by itself. Or you've been given a bunch of tools, maybe your CISO or somebody else up in your management chain went to RSA like this week, right? Went to RSA and bought a bunch of tools for you. So it's like, hey, you got to build a SOC, but by the way, you have to build it around these things that we have, right? That we have bought for you. So it's like I give you this beautiful piece of land so you can build your dream house, and now it's like, yeah, but you have to build around this little hut that you have in the middle, right? So Rob and I, we've experienced this. We've seen this a lot. We've worked as analysts out of SOCs, but we've also done consulting for years, designing, building, operating SOCs, and we've seen this many times. You get, some budget for tools. You start hiring people. You put them in front of the SIEM, right? Send all the logs to the SIEM, and now what? Defend all the things. But how does it really go? Well, Rob doesn't know this, but I have a footage of a SOC analyst looking at the SIEM console. Right? So this is what it looks like. And right, this is how it goes when you have like 10,000 alerts popping into your SIEM console every single day. And that leads to frustration.
Well, that kind of leads me to that story that we had about one of the hunting gigs that we went on, right? So there's a Midwestern organization that Ismael sent me out to go do a hunting engagement with a couple of our peers, and we showed up, and we were only there like 2 or 3 days, and we stumbled across something, and we gave it up to the leadership team to investigate. And then a couple of hours later, the CISO comes down, thanks us for our efforts and our visit, but politely asks us to step out of the war room, that we're going to cancel the engagement at this point. They found something that they need to investigate, and they're calling out their external incident response team. And as we're walking out and we're shaking hands with all the security team folks that we were working with as we were doing this hunting investigation, the SIM guy comes over and he goes, "Hey, Rob, come here, look at this." And while he's excited and he wants to show me, he got our tool up and running and it's doing really good. And he's like, "Look, I got 140,000 alerts. It's so awesome. And where do you think I should start?" And one of the first things that came out of my unfortunately unfiltered mouth at the time was just right click and delete all of them and start over, because you're going to start with that whole alert fatigue where you turned on all the things. It's great that it does a lot of detecting, but what can you work on? What are you focusing on? What's the mission? What's that goal that the team is going after, right? And what is their main objective? And that really leads down to whose fault. You may think that maybe it's somebody's fault or something along that lines, that we found something and they didn't. It's really about operationalizing where and what they need to focus in on. And that really leads us down to, what is the SOC really supposed to be doing? And one of the things that I've done in a couple of talks of late was really drive the customer and the teams and the security operation and into this do something mentality. The SOC can do risk management, and that's a lot what we get back in the feedback mechanism. That's definitely what the executive level needs. But at the operations level, right, the SOC is there to mitigate loss, to stop ransomware, to slow down the adversary's progress and mitigate impact. If they're not doing that, then they're not really approaching the problem. And like things like threat intelligence, forensics teams, your outside investigators, they're all there to help you facilitate that mitigation process. And while you have threat intelligence, that shouldn't be your focus, but it's central to you completing your mission. It's the tipper. It's the ability for somebody to come and give you a hint. Hey, something might be bad over here. Go check this out. Don't focus. And one of the times we find is teams will focus on trying to validate their false positives versus just trying to quickly determine, is this host compromised or not? And that leads me back to a book that Ismael had me read as I was joining his team, right?
Oh, you read it? I didn't know you read it actually.
I read parts of it. It's a long read in a way.
Well, so
But
it's interesting what you're saying, right? I mean, to me, it sounds like what you're describing is lack of maturity, right? A lot of organizations, they start at the tactical level and they stay there all the time, right? And they're putting out fires, they're super busy doing incident response and doing all these things, but are they showing value? Are they conveying value? And that's the hardest part, right? Good security, as I always say, it's boring. So when you manage to have good security operations and the amount of incidents you have to deal with on a daily basis go down, now you're in the danger zone, right? If you fail to convey value, you're going to you're going to show metrics that are the wrong ones, like number of incidents you dealt with this month, right? And then you're going to try to justify that, hey, yeah, we reduced the number of incidents and they're actually now stable for a while. So people will be like, your management might be like, okay, so do we really need that many people? These many expensive people that we have to train, right? Just to look at events on a screen. Oh, I don't want to pay for these people when I can replace them all with this fancy new appliance, or now it's not an appliance, or it's a cloud-based service that has artificial intelligence, right? That is going to replace all of your expensive analysts. Well, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but be careful with that, because if you fail to show this value, right, and align to the business and communicate the right metrics, the right story, that's what it may end up happening. So based on what you're saying, I'm thinking it feels a lot like we need maturity. And now I know it sounds boring, right? We talked about risk management, now maturity. Come on. But it is about that. And it reminded me of this book I told you about, Outliers, from Malcolm Gladwell. Well, he talked about very successful people and how they essentially worked on something, on a problem, or on a challenge, on a skill, like really hard for 10,000 hours. And then it's like, if you put all that time into something, you're going to become a master. But let's face it, we don't have 10,000 hours, right, to put into what we're doing here. So can you learn faster? And then Tim Ferriss came along and said, well, you can become world-class in a skill in 6 months or less. And this is what we call deliberate, through the two practices. One is smart feedback and the other one is deliberate practice. So essentially, if you have the right metrics, right, if you measure what you're doing and you identify your weaknesses, and you have a highly structured plan focusing on developing the sub skills, right, that make up this goal that you have, you can become better in less time. So that's the idea, right?
Yeah, so Ismael, you gave me this book, and again, the funny part about this book that I read, right, was I ended up trying to think about how we apply this to the SOC. And I read your book and I'm trying to think about this, and the next minute I know, I wake up something like this, drooling all over myself. But as I'm waking up and coming to, and I realize that I'm sitting at my desk and it's been a long night trying to get through this, I came up with a thought process about a fractal, that what we really needed was some kind of process, right, that we could apply not only to the top, but to the bottom, and regardless of what business unit or business element was actually performing the function, that they could use this throughout the cycle. And it's more of an operational decision-making and scoping process. Like for an event, you want to discover what you want to go after, right? So what is the smart feedback that you're looking at, and go after that, discover. Then you want to make deliberate practice of it. So you're scoping it, you're monitoring it, and you're learning it, right? And with that, you're going to create some kind of response mechanism to that alert. You're matching it up. And there's other teams that have done some things very similar to that first half. If you talk like Palantir's alert model, where they actually build the alert cycle into their process, you can be able to tie these things together. But then when you get to the other side of, I've built a response, now I want to speed that up, I want to make it faster, so I need to use automation. But in that, all of those things, I still need to be able to share, measure, so that I can transform and change and keep learning through these different pieces. And that's, metrics, deliberate practice, being able to automate the process, because the first time you do the response, it isn't going to be right. You're going to have to do it a couple more times before you can speed it up and automate it. There are going to be some things that you can do deliberately right out of the gate that you don't necessarily need a human in the middle. But there are other things where you're going to need the human in the middle, and you want to be able to help that analyst make a decision or act on that. But then you want to be able to tune and transform and change and keep looking for new things, new hunt capabilities. So when we looked at this, I showed it to Ismael, and when he saw it, he was like, that's pretty cool. And it led us down to, how do we apply this to a security operations story? Like, where do we put this in, and how do we apply it in the 30, 60, 90 model that we came up with for when we were delivering these services for McAfee?
Exactly. So I like the colors, right? But on top of that, and the logo, it's pretty cool. Essentially what we're saying here is, like, look, if you're either building a SOC from scratch, or most likely maturing, improving something that you already have, right? Or something you were given, which is the reality. Most of the environments you join as a new SOC manager or SOC analyst, you're gonna be doing this, right? Discovery, monitor, respond, automate, measure, and transform. But the key thing is, how do you apply this fractal, right? This model. So here's an idea, practical idea of how you can implement this model in cycles, right? This is like kind of a wheel, spiral, however you wanted to define it, but it's a cycle or a series of cycles that will allow you to implement, right? Design, this is where the architecture piece comes in, design, implement, right? Engineer, all of these different things that have to happen in a SOC, not just tools, but also processes and people. So Rob, how do you see this? Like these three iterations, right? 30, 60, 90 days. We have some goals. Do you want to describe that?
So when you look at the 30, 60, 90, you're looking at how you want to do Agile, right? So the goals and the progress is how you tie the fractal into that particular process, right? And what we mean by is, you need to take the fractal and put it in its 30, 60, 90 scenario. And so for us, starting the part of the first 30 days, you want to be able to discover what the business, identify your zones, your critical assets, see key things that we talk about in 530 about how to separate different pieces and components. And then we go into responding, right? What are you going to respond to, right? What is the incident response plan for that process? Maybe you don't have it all fleshed out, maybe you just got a skeleton, but at least you're starting that particular process. And then, what are the core actions of the things that you need to accomplish, right? Is it create a ticket? Is it transferring data from one point to another, like syslogs and whatnot? And then so you can start to measure the things like time to notify, remediate, so that you can get back to the leadership what you're actually doing. And then you keep rotating this process through awareness and focus. So the key will be is that as you keep moving in this fractal, you're constantly adding on to additional processes. The architecting this for an NSM, right, is one of our major components in the first part of net architecting for 530, is you architect with a network visibility. And as you move with the network visibility, you start to move into the process of architecting around the data. But now that you've created this visibility from a network perspective, you can start improving on those processes. And as you can see from like the first part of the 30 days that I just talked about earlier, you'll see as we move and transition from 60 to 90, we create more, we keep adding additional capabilities and making what we originally started, transform it and pivot it and start making it better through these iterative cycles. And we're doing them in short sprints so that we can see the success. You may do 30, 60, 90 for the whole project timeline, but you're only doing maybe 2 weeks or maybe even 3 weeks through the sprint. And then you're taking a downtime to kind of see what's going through that process.
Right. So essentially, if we kind of illustrate this using software development methodologies, we're talking here about Agile. If you think about the older waterfall model, this is what we would typically do, right? A lot of people do this. They start building for or architecting for visibility in the SOC, and they start deploying sensors. And now they bring all of this data into their network security monitoring tools, or they bring all of these alerts into the SIEM. But at that point, you have so much information that what are you going to do with it? Now you start tuning. And that sounds like a good idea until you actually do it and you realize how painful that is. And at the same time, you're not doing other things that you're not paying attention to other things that are happening in the business. So that's the waterfall model, right? Here with the Agile model, we set shorter goals, we iterate faster through this. And if we fail fast, we learn fast, and we pivot, right? We adapt constantly. So for example, in the first 30 days, what's the first thing you gotta do? You gotta figure out what are the crown jewels. So you need to discover the business. And this is where we're going actually through the different steps in the fractal, right? Discover the business. Now we're going to monitor the critical assets. We're going to define zones. We're going to talk about that in a second. We're going to define incident response plan, but not for everything, because that's too much, right? That's too much. We need to divide and conquer. We need to look for incident response plans for just those critical assets. We're going to start automating, but just a few things, right? Rob will explain later, what do we want to automate first? And very important, at that time, right before you start doing anything, you start measuring. What's my current time to notify, to remediate? Why? Because as you go into these iterations of 30, 60, 90 days, you're going to be communicating with the business, showing value, creating awareness, finding out where the gaps are, and doing this in an incremental way. So at the end of this 90-day cycle, you actually have evidence of progress, right? And you have now enough data to be able to keep transforming the organization. And essentially, you can apply this model, this fractal that I showed you before, right, that we showed you, you can apply to different stories. Here we're telling, this is for, we're saying this is for visibility with network security monitoring, but you could apply this to other topics, developing like a catalog of stories if you want. So starting with discovery, we touched a little bit on this, right? The crown jewels, essentially divide and conquer. Can you give maybe some examples, Rob, of how you would do this?
Well, the first thing is you want to ask your business leads if you can get a chance to talk to them and kind of get a feel for what's important, right? What's interview the CISO, what's important to him, interview your individual team members, because you have your own internal equipment that you're concerned about in the security operations team. But then you want to go out and talk to your IT cohorts and see what they're working on. What are the things, what is the business doing, right? And if it doesn't get you any solid answers right out of the gate, what's critical to the enterprise operation, then you want to basically pivot that. And maybe if they have a business continuity plan, you can go after that, because that'll already have the tier of assets that they have. And then you can use that tier of asset to say, are we focused on the right assets in the right tiers? And then you can start to be able to create that process. That'll get you your first starting point. Everybody has basic tiers right out of the gate. And tiers or zones. The question is are you using them to facilitate your security operations? And I love the quote that you put up there, Ismael, about Eisenhower, because it's not so much, no, you're good. It's not so much about the planning, the art of the plan actually working, because we all know no plans survive first contact, but it's the art of actually going through the planning process that you start to think about those things and what use cases you may need to fit around or work around. So when we start building our response processes, they're really tied around what zone, what category, what severity, what sensitivity, what kind of business impact or resource tier is going to be affected by this. Or do we care about the Dockerized web server that's sitting on front, or do we care more about the database that's serving that web server up front? Those are the kinds of things that you've got to understand a little bit about the architecture and how the architecture is played out, and what tool's going to protect those capabilities, and where are you going to prioritize those alarms with everything else in your environment, right? So the first thing that we start out in a lot of customer environments is, well, what are your zones? And they go like, we don't have zones. Okay, well, how about we just look at your architecture in a very simplistic way? You have a DMZ, right? Yep, we have a DMZ. You have a server farm. Yep, we have a server farm. Awesome. You have two zones right there. right? Then you have your user environment, right? That is your third zone, right? Now you have, at a minimum, you have 3 zones that you can work with. And where's the risk in those 3 zones, right? The DMZ is going to be the most immediate risk, as Equifax would tell you, right? If it's facing the internet and people have enough time and energy, they'll find a way in, right? That'll lead them back into the data center. So if that gets them back into the data center, now, did they need to phish anybody, even though phishing is like 91% successful? Nope. But the data center doesn't get phished, right, Ismael? Or have you seen the data center getting phished, a server being phished?
Well, no administrator, domain administrator will ever browse out of a domain controller, from the data center. Never, ever.
That never happens, right?
No, absolutely not. So you know what? It's very simple what I'm going to do here, but do you allow me to do some whiteboarding? I just want to have fun with the camera, Okay, let's see if you can see this. I'm gonna go full screen here. So yeah, I'm gonna use some new technology to do something old school, right? That's what Rob told me once about this. And so imagine what Rob is describing. Right here you have a firewall, and excuse my poor drawing skills. Very simple. You have something like your LAN, right? And obviously this will be another zone. And hopefully you have some level of segmentation where you have another segment here. This is going to be your crown jewels, of course, right? So your crown jewels. And at the very least, I'm hoping that your domain controllers and some other sensitive servers are here, so maybe some databases, etc. And here in your LAN, of course, you have your workstations, your laptops that get infected, and all that stuff. And this is a very traditional perimeter-focused architecture, right, with your DMZ servers, your web servers, email, etc. Now, just based on this, let's say we're following along the example. We want to architect for visibility. These are firewalls, could be IPSs. You have mostly protection-oriented technologies. Where will you deploy sensors for visibility purposes? Now assume unlimited budget, right? So you didn't have a problem with that. You can throw as many as you want. Where will you place them, Rob?
Well, I want to place them right under the perimeter router. Wouldn't that be a good spot? So I could see all the attacks coming in?
Right here? Well,
right there.
If you don't have anything else to do, right? If you want to have some fun, instead of watching Netflix, you could just look at all the logs and everything that's happening right there. This is going to be super noisy, of course, and of course Rob knows it. Why? Because you're going to get all the traffic that goes into the organization, all the scans. Of course, everybody's scanning everybody. So a lot of people would say, this might be interesting from an intelligence perspective. I want to get intelligence. In 530, we actually talk about better ways of doing that through the use of tripwires and honey tokens, etc. So I'm not a big fan of this one. I'm pretty sure Rob isn't either. But essentially, the idea is we want to add these capabilities of being able to have to identify, right, to have visibility and detection everywhere where we have a mostly preventive device. So the same way that you have walls, doors, knobs, and you use them for protection primarily, and then you have a camera, right, a CCTV, a camera that is pointing to that door to see if something sneaks through, something flies under the radar. So for example, a sensor here, this is what we call the umbrella sensor. Right? Let's say that you have something like Snore or Suricata, right, or Zeek, right? I was going to write bro. Zeek IDS. Now, how do you think this is going to be? Is this going to be noisy?
Absolutely.
Very noisy, right? Because we have a lot of things going on in this segment, going out to the internet, browsing, and you get all this traffic coming back. So very noisy, lots of false positives, right? Lots of false positives. Now, how about here in your crown jewels? Do you want to have a sensor?
Well, that would probably be the first place I would put it, right? Because based on our design, what we're talking about here, focusing on the crown jewels, wouldn't you want to put it there first so you could focus and tune going
Absolutely.
outward versus coming in?
And this is where divine and conquer, right? And the discovery phase comes handy because we're going to focus on what matters most. So we know that these guys might be infected. We know client-side exploitation, phishing, it's always a primary vector, but this is used as a first step to pivot, right? To pivot where, well, to find out where the domain controllers are, pull off the golden ticket attack, try to find where the sensitive information is, the databases, the PCI data, the credit card data, whatever that the attacker wants to do with this. Or, it could be also to push some payloads manually to demand hold a hostage of these systems and demand a ransom. But in any case, imagine that you deploy all of the sensors. Obviously, same in the DMZ. You want to have a sensor here too to look at what's going on. The level of criticality of the alerts coming out of these IDS sensors will be vastly different. So for example, if you see an alert coming from this segment, how is that going to be? Is it going to be priority 1?
Absolutely.
Absolutely,
Right?
like super critical. Absolutely, right? Why? Because we should know what we have here. That should be very low false positives, right? And if we have some false negatives, well, it might still be okay because we want to make sure that we don't miss anything. This sensor here on the other side is going to be tuned for low false positives, which means that we're going to have high false negatives. And how about the threats? We touched a little bit on some of the threats here, but the DMZ, are the threats applicable to the DMZ the same as the threats applicable to the LAN?
If not, they're actually more, right? Because that's always available, right? The LAN may not always be available to them, but the DMZ is always there. It's always present.
Right. So essentially, for instance, for web-facing servers, which is what we're saying, you're going to be looking at the OWASP top 10, right? Things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, anything that it's more like server-side, right? Whereas on your LAN, you're going to be focusing on client-side exploitation, different threats, and sometimes even like different skills. Maybe you have a bunch of Linux servers on your DMZ, and you have to understand, right, how these servers look like, how they're configured to be able to tune these things and to interpret some of these alerts versus knowledge of maybe Windows operating systems, right, on your LAN. So see how this, first of all, the discovery and the implementation of classification strategies, right, will help you to have a less noisy environment and to prioritize things in your environment. But this is zoning from pretty much a network perspective. But could you do the same with, let's say, users? Can we do the same with users? Can we define tiers of users? For example, Rob, what are some of if you think of users in an organization we're trying to protect, do they all have the same value? What do you think?
Well, do we want to protect the HR team the same way we want to protect finance versus the IT admins?
Right. So you probably want to define tiers as well, right? So it could be tier 1, could be your C-level executives, right? Tier 2 could be anybody in the IT department that have high privilege, that could be, that could hold the keys of the kingdom, the domain controllers, for example, right? So domain admins. Maybe tier 3 is, the rest of your users. How about categorizing, Rob, as you said, based on business units, right? So we have business units, HR, we have finance, and we may even have, countries. Now, the interesting thing about organizing your security operations in this way, divide and conquer, it will allow you to build use cases that are meaningful and say, okay, so we have an incident affecting the zone LAN, right? User, let's say it's regular users in tier 3. In the business unit that is, let's pick whatever business unit that is not really critical to the organization. Well, the priority of this alert will be lower than having an event, maybe the same zone, right? It's the zone land, but it's affecting tier 1 and it's the finance department, right? Maybe the CFO system, it's behaving suspiciously. And obviously the criticality of that, it's going to be higher. So do you think is this something that works, Rob, or am I going like way too far with this and making it very complicated?
It seems like you're making it complicated, right? But it's really not that complicated. The key is that what happens, and this is a common question. I walk into a SOC and I ask them a question on their category or their zones. It's like, so what zones are you working? And they look at me like deer in the headlights. And I'm like, okay, well then answer me this simple question. You have an event from a server that occurs that looks to be it's beaconing out. You have an event from you have a email request from the CEO saying that he's being phished. Which one are you going to work first? And that's where people just start looking at you weird, right? And going, oh, well, I don't know. Well, I've worked the CEO first. I'm like, well, which one's your critical to the business? Is the CEO's event more critical than the server that's serving, say, 10,000 people or 100,000 customers, and it's making money hour after hour, minute after minute, and you're losing your reputation? Might not be the same thing to work on the same level. Now, we all have our own business dynamics to work around, but that's what this categorization, and you present that to leadership, they'll understand why you're making the prioritizations that you're doing and why those focuses. And it won't look like you're prioritizing the CEO over a critical business application that requires the business to run, right? Because I've been in that scenario, right, where we've had the critical business app go down while we were working a VIP issue, right? And that's really a horrible place to be in.
And you start talking business language as well, right? You're relating to something that is strategic to the business. And the beautiful thing about this is that you can also now define, once you have the zones, you can define for these different use cases, what are the event sources, right? We have a couple of examples here, right?
Exactly.
Like an outbound zone from the endpoint going out to the internet. What are the sources that you have? And this is an example, right? You may pull data off your antivirus or EDR solution, whatever you are running on the endpoint, DNS traffic, hopefully, proxy, firewall. Now, for your inbound zone, think about maybe your DMC, right? Where are you gonna bring those logs from? So it forces you to think in a more tactical way than just like, bringing everything into your SIEM and trying to make sense out of it.
Exactly. And you can see here where we try to tie those pieces together for that one. What are the essential security feeds that you need to have visible, right? And where do they fit in your architecture? And when we start talking in 530, when we start managing the network, look, we have Bro IDS on there. Haha, we need to fix that sometime soon. But I like Zeek too, but Bro's cooler in some ways. But I'm an old school guy. The idea is that when we put these pieces together and we start to stack them up, you start to be able to have the information you need to process an event like command and control access going on in your environment, because now you have the DNS queries to ask the right question. But you also have to make sure that you're recording the DNS off the right box, right? Ismael, we had fun at a customer where they were sending you the logs the logs off the wrong box.
Yes, DNS, it's funny, right? Early 2020, it's still a problem for a lot of organizations, and it really shouldn't be. But the key is with this categorization, right, and applying this model, you can now build meaningful use cases and start dividing and conquering, right? Prioritizing and making something that it's really, maybe it's a daunting task, it's really big, you can digest it in smaller chunks. And this is what we call threat content engineering. It allows you to simplify the process of creating these use cases. For example, as we can see here, to detect something like DNS tunneling, like in Security 530, it's the very first exercise we do. Some students get a bit intimidated. It's like, ooh, wow, first lab, we're going to do exfiltration over DNS. It's like, sure, why not, right? and then we start like looking into, all right, how can you mitigate this? And from an architecture perspective, what are the things you can do to prevent it if it's preventable, right? And not only to that, for that, but also to detect it and to get visibility. And this allows you to do all of that instead of just playing whack-a-mole, right? And it also helps you to respond. We're going to see that later on. So all of this and more, that you're going to see some of that next in the next few slides, is part of a project that Rob, myself, Carrick Dooley, and Carlos Diaz worked on, and we built around this project TTP0. A lot of these slides and more, it's on the GitHub, that you have the link there. So I would encourage you to please, whether you're watching this live right now or you're going to be listening through the recording in the future, please go check it out and let us know how you feel, if you think it's useful. A lot of people that has had an opportunity to see this came back to us and said, wow, I didn't realize all of this was out there for us to use, and it really made a difference. Usually we find a lot of information on the internet on tools and configuration of Sysmon and Bro IDS or Zeek, but not that much about processes, right? And how the strategic piece on how to build and mature a SOC. So we're just going to run through some of those slides, just a number of examples that help you to develop effective use cases around this topic of zones, categories, sensitivity, tiers, etc. You want to explain just a little bit? We're not going to read everything, right? But a little bit of how this is organized, Rob.
Yep. So we broke it up in a large, like if it was a dream SOC and you could do anything you want and money was no cost and you're going to build it from scratch, or maybe you need to build an MSSP capability, any one of those capabilities, you really have like 3 types of teams, right? You have your operations team that is actually running the security operations. You have your back-end engineering team, which is like your SIM engineer, your products engineers, and your threat content engineer, somebody who's more like a threat modeler or red teamer that's actually helping them focus. And then you have your advanced cyber services, which is basically your intelligence folks and your forensics folks. You're more advanced. Now, a lot of times customers, depending on what they have and what capability, they may outsource their advanced cyber services to a third party and have them on call, because usually having a lot of those resources tends to be expensive. But being able to have the same zoning and be able to manage those zones for different teams, whether it be a public zone, a main exit zone, or critical resources, and having that procedural security monitoring, those first level tasks that you want people to do to validate, and then they're pitching it over. Hey, I found something interesting you might want to look at, level 2, and the level 2 looks at the process, right? And when this was built, right, we didn't have source, so all these level 1 triage things all had to be done by hand. And Ismael and I, we built a tool called Roster Drawer back in the day that basically did this semi-automated, so that a level 1 could quickly review what was triaged and then turn around and pass it off to a level 2 or level 3. Hey, we have a problem. Can you look at this system and make a determination of whether this was compromised or not? And then you use your level 3s to drive your incident response process if you have a larger event going on. That really ties you back to, well, what are all the things that your SOC needs to do, right? And a lot of people just start SOCing and doing SOC and doing incident response, but what are the services that you're providing back to the business? How are you measuring those services, right? What's your customer service value? What's your service catalog? Notice that these are a lot of the infrastructure, information technology infrastructure library models of service catalog, because we can use those same techniques to run the SOC effectively to show business value above and beyond just stopping the blocking, right? Because we still have to present and show value in marketing, or show marketing capabilities, right, to the leadership, because when there's no incidents happening, do you really think that you still need the security operations in play? The best SOCs that we see don't generally generate a lot of alerts. They don't go raising the red flag every 5 minutes. They quietly resolve an issue and move on to the next task. And nobody, if at best, nobody even knows it actually happened, right? So this revolves around having some core service capabilities around your operations team, around your engineering team, and what are you going to monitor and what are you going to respond to? And these slides that we talk through here have lots of detail in them, and please take your time to go through and dig through the details, because they'll surely help you through your SOC process later down the road when you want to enrich things. Did you have anything you wanted to say, Ismael?
No, just wanted to say that we're gonna go through this like faster as we're doing right now, but I don't want you to believe that this is just like, some marketing stuff. It's actually, the way that, we've built the SOCs and the way we've maintained them. So it is definitely something that works.
Yep, and we've built them in really two basic applied models, right? We built the dream everything you want, the whole full coverage model, which is basically what you're seeing here. And then we've got an additional slides on what do you need to have like a zero-tier model to manage your environment. Maybe you don't want to build a big, massive SOC in the process, and you want a small, limited tiger team that has the ability to react fast, move fast, and has enough knowledge and background. What are those skills and abilities? Well, we give you all the skills and abilities here, but we also give you what kind of technique, what kind of team you need. And I think the Tiger team that we developed was like a 12-man team for security operations as a whole. And that's security engineering, that's advanced cyber services, and that's operational management of the events and alerts that are occurring on a regular basis. And then we tie all this in. This larger model we tied into like shift models and pulled it all together and said, evaluate the 3 different shift models and how do you want to apply them and where's the best benefit? Like looking at it from like, do you want to be like firefighters and only work 3 days and take 4 days off? Or do you want to work 12-hour days? Do you want to work 16-hour days? And we looked at each model and then kind of presented out the pros and cons for each model.
Right. Yep. So here's some of those models. Yeah.
And then as we move to that last piece, what are the tools you need, right? And just going back and grabbing, okay, what are the tools that I need to actually do an effective job? What back-end pieces? So just like a semi-checklist of what does engineering need? What does the ACS team need? What does the ops team need? So we can tile these pieces together. Now, these are just tool recommendations, but it doesn't necessarily mean these are the tools that you should be using. If you don't want to buy a next generation tool, maybe you could use Sysmon and basically try to use Sysmon to be able to be that reporting capability and put it into, let's say, a free tool like Security Onion, which gives you like PCAP capability that's relatively inexpensive across the board other than paying for disk space.
I noticed that this is the last. We kept actually this one for the last for a reason, and it's that you don't start with the tools, right? Sometimes, and especially like people like us, like technical folks, we enjoy, the tools, we enjoy playing with the toys. But the reality is that you need to define, first of all, the mission, right? The mission of the security operations team, how you're going to support the business based on that, based on the discovery of that, right? You need to define the capabilities that you want to have. And if you follow that process, right, the zones, the tiers, all that model that we just discussed, then choosing the tools, it's the easiest part, right? And it's just a matter of putting them in the right spot. These are the tools I need to enable me or my team to provide these capabilities or these services to the business. So it becomes much, much easier to justify why you want to invest on these things, which is usually a problem, right, as well. When it's like, why do I have to go and deploy Zeek sensors? Well, what's the benefit you get versus this other thing? That's why it's important that you define those capabilities first.
And that's one of the cool things that we learned that when I first took the 530 class and why I wanted to be an instructor for it was there were things that I didn't have visibility on that I knew were in the architecture, but I'm not really focused on that event or that process on a regular basis, because the SOC generally deals with host-based intrusion almost all the time, every time, but that's not always everything that gets compromised. And being able to look at having 530 give you the different tools and show you why these tools are in place from an architectural standpoint will help you focus in on what things you need to be alerting on different tools so that you can get like whitelisting capabilities for different things, right? So if you changing the banner on your host on your web server from an Apache to an IAS, and seeing who's trying to attack your IAS box gives you an indicator that, hey, I'm actually under attack on a regular basis, versus you not knowing because it's constantly being hit by regular access. So when we start building response plans, one of the things that I like to use when I help a customer go through it is the Lego block approach. Basically block these pieces together. Now, we've all probably, if you haven't heard of MITRE attack model in any time or place in the last couple of months or maybe even years now, you might be under a rock. And if you are, please come out so we can share the beauty that is the MITRE model. And we can give you attack.org, and you can basically go look at the attack.mitre.org website and see a bunch of awesome techniques. Those techniques are great for helping you learn how to hunt and getting you the starting place to hunt, but they're not really the techniques you want to focus on response. Instead, you really want to focus up on the tactic and then build your investigative models around your tactics, right? And then turn around, because what are you trying to do at the end? You're trying to determine whether that host is compromised. So if you have a C2 beacon, it's all too often I see customers trying to validate their threat intelligence. Is the IP address that it hit a false positive, rather than going back to the host and going, does this host have a malicious process? Does it have persistence on it? Can I see the connection, right? And the faster you pick up those things, you'll be able to see fairly quickly. Like, for example, if you did netstat NAOB, which everybody learns in 504, you did netstat NAOB on the box, and the box returned back a random character.exe process, you don't need any more indication that that box got malware on it, right? If you don't get any connection back, you might be even more scared, because why doesn't Windows know about the network connection that occurred, and why doesn't it have the process ID? Those all create different pieces. So being able to move your investigation pieces from there to the host gets you things like looking at the tool analysis sheet from JP CERT, or Japan CERT team, where they actually go through and take a bunch of different tools and a bunch of different capabilities, and they do an analysis, and they show you all the artifacts that are being created by these different tools and techniques used against your system, so that you can just basically go, hey, if somebody's using this kind of tool, this is the kind of indicator that we're looking for. And now I can just tune my rule or tune my search to go look for this particular technique. If I see this technique, then I know this has occurred on my system, and I can move on from there.
Right.
That really goes back to, go ahead, Ismael, you wanted to say something?
No, I was going to say I'm a big fan of all the stuff that Japan CERT does, and they keep surprising me. Right? They come up with these cool projects and tools, and it's really cool that what they did was based on the MITRE attack matrix, right? You have a number of threat actors and most common tools. What they did was they got 49 of these tools, including Mimikatz, password dump, a lot of other tools that are commonly used by attackers. They run them all against these Windows boxes, and now they looked at what are the artifacts that are created, right? Using Sysmon, looking at the Windows event logs, MFT. So pretty cool, great resource in spirit of sharing practical things, right, that you can use right away.
I think that GIF should be on your first slide, because that's what a lot of customers do, is they play whack-a-mole.
The cat, love the cat.
That cat, yeah, love that cat whack-a-mole.
He'll never catch it. He'll never catch it. But that's why you need to have, so we're talking here, basic capabilities in place. How do you start, right? What are the most critical things to start with at the response phase? Have some ability to determine root cause. That's super critical, because without that, how are you going to convey value to the organization? How are you going to affect change policies, right? Apply lessons learned. So another big topic here, and Rob, I'm pretty sure you've seen a lot of horror stories when people start remediating right away without having the full scope of what's the story, what's going on here. Right? Gone are the days when you would have isolated incidents for no reason. Now there's always a campaign, there's always a motivation behind absolutely every single piece of malware that it's implanted on your network, right? So that's why it's very important that you get to root cause analysis, to the triage, and to be able to do scoping, right?
Yep, and that scoping leads you to automation, right? When being able to move forward and using like our tool for drone and the Hive, and you create these incident zone categories and pieces, and now you found something that was bad, you send it up into drone, and then drone pushes it into Hive and automatically categorizes it for the team, right? Because what you want your analysts to do is focus on that decide and act process, right? When you get to automation, whether you're using a full SOAR product or you're going with the Hive and Cortex responders and just trying to regularly enrich IOCs and indicators, you want to get to that quarantine faster, right? Get out of the ticket for reimage and get into, can I quarantine the system? Because if you can quarantine the system fast, ransomware doesn't become a problem anymore. You quarantine ransomware in 5 to 10 seconds, it has very minimal impact. You wait an hour to quarantine it, it's going to have a huge impact, right? So seeing those investigative blocks that we showed you earlier and trying to take your C2 beacon to the process, that process to persistence to show host compromise leads you down the path. And all of these things can lead you into the next thing that you want to do is be able to measure what's going on, right? And taking your object into how do you measure time to detect and time to focus on things, right? Because if you're focusing on your output and your input of those integrations, then you can focus on what you need to measure.
Yep, absolutely. And the measuring part, it's again critical for the communication, right, to the business and to convey value. Not only when you're really busy, like putting out fires, which is obvious, it's noticeable, but especially when you're not, you're doing your job, right, at preventing and monitoring, and not preventing compromise, but detecting compromise quickly enough, as you just were just saying, Rob, and being able to limit the impact of those incidents. So what are some of the metrics that you've seen that, let's say, an organization wants to start with a basic set of metrics? What are the first ones they should focus on in your experience?
Well, the first ones I recommend that they should focus on is time to detect. And now this isn't the tool detection. This is the time that the analyst sees the object, right? When does the analyst get the ability to actually review the object, right? Because if I have this thing that I do in the class, but if you have an event and nobody sees it, did it really happen? You can't say it did, right? So the key is getting that time to detect. Now the next one is time to respond. What's the time it takes for them to acknowledge the event, then to turn around and what do they need to do for a response, right? What is the investigative steps that they need to start? When do they start picking up the task, right? Just because they've seen it doesn't necessarily mean they start doing something against it, because there may be a prioritization problem going on, or then that's where those categories and that zoning comes in, because you'll prioritize the right things with the right timing, and not be cherry picking the easy password reset over the server compromise, for example. And then
Right.
getting to containment and recovery, right? And then resolving those events, right? Because we do want to resolve them, but recovery is probably more important, because how do we validate that measurement of the image the system was reimaged, but how do we validate that the customer's back and operational?
So these are just some of the many things we have in this website for TTP0. So again, I encourage you to go there, check it out. We have a bunch of templates. I think Rob was touching before on how you can architect your SOC, for example, around a 3-tier architecture, right, which is the most common one, or a 0-tier one, maybe depending on the culture of your organization, budget, etc. Lots of different templates and documents for you to use there. And we just walk through a number of them. But of course, the main topic here is we want to empower our blue teams, right? We want to give back to the blue team community. And as we always say, Justin, Eric, myself, Rob, yeah, red teaming is cool, right? But blue teamer is cooler. Because this is where the value is. This is the reason for the red team to exist, right? So we can learn, we can put into practice all these different things to protect the organization. So we're really committed to make the blue team community awesome, right? That's what we're trying to do here.
I remember you telling me a story about a red teamer's job, right? They basically set up set up a host and compromise a host, and then they go play Xbox for an hour,
Oh, yeah.
weeks, months, right?
You will have to come to class to hear that story, though.
Yes,
Because,
absolutely.
essentially, because I think we're running out of time here. Whew. All right. So, yeah, anything any ideas that you have to make the Blue Team community better through tools, blog posts, projects like this, you want to collaborate, please let us know. All right. So, Jessica, I'll hand it back to you. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you, Ismael and Rob. That's actually all the time that we do have for today. Any questions that are not answered, you may submit them to q@sans.org, or do you two have any links for them to send the questions to you two?
They can always ping us on Twitter. They can DM us on Twitter if you want.
Yep, exactly.
All right.
So here's our
Perfect.
Twitter handle.
Okay.
Feel free to follow us and ask any questions through that.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Ismael and Rob again for your great presentation, which helps brings this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.